Sometimes the hardest battles we face aren't against the world, but against the grief that lives inside us. When you lose the person who made life worth living, even the simplest choices feel impossible. Hank Mori knew this pain all too well. After his wife died from cancer, the 54-year-old mechanic couldn't bear to stay home anymore. Every corner of their house whispered her name, so he drove into the Mojave Desert looking for work and maybe some peace. That's when he found the plane. Half buried in sand, rusted and forgotten, it looked like it had been there for decades. But when Hank checked the tail number, his blood ran cold. This aircraft was from Fukushima, Japan. It had vanished on March 11, 2011, the day the tsunami changed everything. Inside the plane, Hank discovered something that would haunt him forever. But what could be so shocking that it made a grown man scream? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The antiseptic smell of the hospital still haunted Hank's memories 6 months later. He could close his eyes and be right back in that sterile room, watching the monitors that tracked Sarah's fading heartbeat. The rhythmic beeping had become the soundtrack of his worst nightmare, each electronic pulse marking another moment closer to losing the woman who had been his anchor for 22 years. Sarah's medical records sat in a manila folder on his kitchen table, untouched since the funeral director had handed them to him. Inside were the clinical details of her final battle, blood counts, treatment schedules, doctor's notes that reduced her vibrant life to numbers and medical terminology. Hank couldn't bring himself to open that folder. The memories were enough. She fought like hell, he whispered to the empty kitchen, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah had never complained, not even when the chemotherapy stole her auburn hair and left her weak as a shadow of herself. She'd smiled through every treatment, cracking jokes with the nurses and holding Hank's hand when he was the one falling apart. The house in Barstow felt too big now, too quiet. Every room held traces of Sarah, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her coffee mug still sitting in the sink because Hank couldn't bear to wash it, the half-finished crossword puzzle on the dining room table with her neat handwriting filling in the blanks. He'd thought about moving, but this house was where they'd raised Emma, where they'd built their life together. Walking away felt like abandoning Sarah all over again. Emma, his 16-year-old daughter, was another wound he didn't know how to heal. She'd inherited Sarah's stubborn streak and her mother's way of cutting straight to the heart of things, but where Sarah had been gentle, Emma was sharp edges and barely contained anger. She blamed him for not being strong enough during Sarah's illness, for breaking down when she needed him to be the rock of the family. "You just disappeared, Dad," she'd said during one of their rare conversations. "Mom was dying, and you just checked out." She wasn't wrong. While Sarah battled cancer with grace and determination, Hank had retreated into himself, spending more time in his garage workshop than at her bedside. He'd told himself he was working to pay the medical bills. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He was a coward. Watching the strongest person he'd ever known waste away had broken something inside him, and instead of facing it, he'd hidden behind carburetors and engine blocks. Now, Emma barely spoke to him. She came home from school, grabbed something from the refrigerator, and disappeared into her room. The few times he'd tried to bridge the gap between them, she'd looked at him with Sarah's green eyes full of disappointment and hurt. She was grieving too, but she was doing it alone because her father had forgotten how to be present for anyone, including himself. Hank's background as a mechanic had always been his identity. His hands knew the language of engines, could diagnose problems by sound and feel. He'd learned the trade from his father, who'd learned it from his father before him. But there was another part of his heritage that he rarely talked about. His great-grandmother on his mother's side had been Japanese, a picture bride who'd come to California in the 1920s. She died when Hank was young, but he remembered her. gentle hands teaching him to fold origami cranes, and her soft voice speaking words in a language he didn't understand. That small thread of Japanese ancestry had always fascinated him, though he'd never pursued it beyond occasional curiosity about the culture and history. Sarah had encouraged him to learn more, even suggesting they visit Japan for their 20th anniversary, but life had gotten in the way. Now she was gone, and those dreams felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The salvage work in the Mojave Desert had started as a practical solution. The medical bills had eaten through their savings, and Emma would need money for college soon. But more than that, the desert offered something his house couldn't: solitude. Out there among the Joshua trees and endless sand, he could work with his hands and let his mind go quiet. No memories lurking around every corner, no daughters' accusing eyes, no neighbors offering casseroles and condolences he didn't know how to accept. His reputation as a skilled mechanic had spread through the network of desert scavengers and collectors, who made their living pulling valuable parts from abandoned vehicles and machinery scattered across the wasteland. The desert was a graveyard of human ambition. Rusted cars from the 50s, abandoned mining equipment, even old military vehicles left behind from long-forgotten training exercises. Each piece told a story of dreams deferred or disasters survived, and Hank found comfort in giving these forgotten machines a second chance at usefulness. The work was honest and solitary, exactly what he needed. He'd drive out before dawn with his tools and his truck, spend the day wrestling with corroded bolts and seized engines, and return home after dark with parts that would fetch decent money from collectors and restoration enthusiasts. Emma would already be asleep or pretending to be, and Hank would sit in his garage, cleaning his tools and planning the next day's expedition. It wasn't much of a life, but it was manageable. The grief was still there, a constant ache in his chest that some days felt like it might crush him, but the work gave him purpose. Every engine he brought back to life, every part he salvaged from the desert's embrace, felt like a small victory against the entropy that seemed to govern everything else in his world. Emma had other ideas about his coping mechanisms. "This isn't healthy, Dad," she'd said one evening, cornering him as he loaded his truck for another desert expedition. "You're running away from everything. Mom wouldn't want this." The mention of Sarah's name had hit him like a physical blow. Emma was right. Of course, Sarah would have wanted him to grieve, to heal, to find a way back to the living. She would have wanted him to be there for their daughter, to help Emma navigate her own grief instead of abandoning her to figure it out alone. But knowing what Sarah would have wanted and being able to do it were two different things entirely. "I'm working," he'd replied, his voice flat and defensive. "Someone has to pay the bills." Emma's laugh had been bitter, so much like her mother's when Sarah was frustrated with his stubborn streak. "The bills are paid, Dad. I've seen the bank statements. You're making enough from your regular work to cover everything. This desert, this is about you running away." She'd walked back into the house without waiting for his response, leaving Hank standing in the driveway with the weight of her words settling on his shoulders like sand. She was 16 years old and saw through him with the clarity that only comes from sharing someone's DNA and watching them fall apart in real time. But even knowing she was right didn't make it easier to stay home, surrounded by memories and expectations he couldn't meet. The desert didn't judge him for his failures as a husband or father. The desert simply was, vast and indifferent and full of broken things that could still be made useful with the right tools and enough patience. As Hank prepared for another day in the Mojave, loading his truck with wrenches and cutting torches, and the cooler full of water that would keep him alive under the punishing sun, he wondered if maybe Emma was right. Maybe he was running away, but running towards something and running away from something could look exactly the same from the outside, and sometimes a man didn't know which one he was doing until he reached his destination. The house was quiet. As he pulled out of the driveway, Emma's bedroom window dark. She was probably awake, listening to him leave again, adding this departure to the growing list of evidence that her father had chosen grief over family. Hank told himself he'd make it up to her somehow, find a way to bridge the gap between them. But first, he had to figure out how to bridge the gap between who he used to be and who he was becoming. The desert was waiting, vast and forgiving in its own harsh way, full of broken things that might still have value if someone cared enough to dig them up and see what could be salvaged. Hank drove toward the horizon, chasing the sunrise and hoping that today might be the day he found something worth saving, even if that something turned out to be himself. The sun was already brutal at 9 in the morning when Hank spotted the glint of metal half buried in a wash about 30 miles northeast of Barstow. He'd been following tire tracks from an old mining road, looking for anything worth salvaging, when the morning light caught something that didn't belong to the landscape of creosote bushes and scattered rocks. At first glance, it looked like another piece of abandoned mining equipment. The desert was littered with the rusted bones of failed ventures. But as Hank climbed down into the wash and brushed away decades of accumulated sand and debris, he realized he was looking at something far more unusual. The curved metal surface emerging from the sand wasn't industrial machinery. It was aircraft, aluminum, weathered and oxidized, but unmistakably part of a fuselage. Hank had always been methodical in his approach to salvage work. Sarah used to tease him about his need to catalog and examine everything before making a move, but that careful nature had served him well over the years. He walked the perimeter of the buried aircraft using a collapsible shovel from his truck to clear away sand and get a sense of the plane's size and orientation. What he found made him pause and reconsider everything he thought he knew about aviation history in the Mojave. This wasn't a small private plane or a military trainer that had crashed during World War II exercises. The exposed sections revealed a twin-engine aircraft, medium-sized, with design elements that looked distinctly foreign. The wing configuration and engine mounts were unlike anything American manufacturers had produced in the era when most desert crashes occurred. Working carefully to avoid damaging any structural elements, Hank spent 2 hours excavating enough of the aircraft to access what appeared to be a maintenance panel near the cockpit. His hands, steady despite the years and the grief, worked the corroded latches until the panel swung open to reveal a small compartment containing the aircraft's identification plate. The metal plate was heavily corroded, its surface eaten away by decades of desert exposure, but enough remained visible to make Hank's breath catch in his throat. The characters etched into the metal weren't in English, they were Japanese, and below the foreign script, partially obscured by corrosion but still legible, was a registration number and what appeared to be a date, March 11th, 2011. Hank sat back, on his heels, staring at the identification plate as his mind raced to process what he was seeing. March 11th, 2011 was a date burned into the collective memory of anyone who'd watched the news that spring. The day the 9.0 earthquake had struck off the coast of Japan, triggering the devastating tsunami that killed nearly 20,000 people and caused the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima power plant. But what was a Japanese aircraft doing buried in the Mojave Desert? And how had it gotten here from Fukushima on the very day the disaster struck? Hank pulled out his phone, grateful for the surprising strength of the cell signal in this particular corner of the desert. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he photographed the identification plate from multiple angles, then began searching aviation databases for any record of aircraft matching the partial registration number he could make out. The search. Results that came back made his hands tremble slightly as he scrolled through the information. According to the records, the aircraft had been a Mitsubishi Mu-2, a twin turboprop plane manufactured in Japan and used primarily for business and government transport. The registration number matched an aircraft that had been reported missing on March 11, 2011, during evacuation flights from the Fukushima area. The plane had simply vanished from radar during the chaos of the disaster, presumed lost over the Pacific Ocean, along with its pilot and any passengers. There had been no distress calls, no debris field, no trace of what had happened to the aircraft or the people aboard. It had become one of the many smaller tragedies lost in the magnitude of the larger disaster, a footnote in the official records of lives disrupted and destroyed by the earthquake and tsunami. But here it was, thousands of miles from where it should have crashed, buried in sand instead of lost at sea. Hank studied the excavated sections of the fuselage, looking for signs of impact damage or structural failure that might explain how the plane had ended up in the California desert. What he found defied easy explanation. The aircraft showed signs of a hard landing, buckled metal near the landing gear, stress fractures in the wing roots, but nothing that suggested a catastrophic crash. This plane had been flown here, landed here, and then either abandoned or deliberately buried. The sand accumulation patterns suggested it had been here for years, slowly disappearing beneath the desert's patient erosion. As the morning wore on and the temperature climbed toward dangerous levels, Hank found himself consumed by the mystery of the aircraft's presence. He'd always been drawn to puzzles, to the satisfaction of understanding how things worked and why they sometimes failed. But this puzzle was different. It wasn't just mechanical, it was human. Someone had flown this plane from a disaster zone in Japan to the middle of the American desert, and Hank couldn't imagine any scenario that made sense of such a journey. He circled the partially excavated aircraft again, taking photographs and measurements, documenting everything with the same careful attention he'd learned to apply to his salvage work. But unlike the usual desert finds, abandoned cars and discarded machinery that held value only in their component parts, this discovery felt weighted with significance he couldn't yet understand. The identification plate had revealed the plane's origin and the date of its disappearance, but it had also raised a dozen new questions. Who had been flying the aircraft? How had they crossed the Pacific Ocean in a plane not designed for such a journey? Why had they come to this particular spot in the Mojave, miles from any airport or emergency landing field? As Hank prepared to leave the site, the desert heat was becoming dangerous even for someone accustomed to working in extreme conditions. He noticed something that had escaped his attention during the initial excavation. Near what appeared to be the main cabin door, partially obscured by a section of displaced sand, was a seam in the fuselage that didn't match the aircraft's normal construction. Closer examination revealed what looked like a sealed compartment, deliberately integrated into the plane's structure, but not part of the original design. Someone had modified this aircraft, adding a hidden space that wasn't visible from the outside. The compartment's access panel was secured with latches that had resisted the desert's corrosive effects, suggesting they were made from higher-grade materials than the surrounding aircraft structure. Hank's salvage instincts warred with his growing sense that this discovery was bigger than anything he was equipped to handle. The smart thing would be to contact the authorities, report the find, and let professionals deal with whatever secrets the aircraft might hold. But the same stubborn curiosity that had made him a good mechanic, the need to understand how things worked and why they sometimes broke, wouldn't let him walk away without at least trying to open that sealed compartment. The latches were stiff with age and corrosion, but Hank's experienced hands coaxed them open with the patient application of penetrating oil and steady pressure. When the compartment finally opened with a metallic groan, the first thing that struck him was the smell. Not the dry, dusty odor of the desert, but something else. Something that spoke of preservation, of space that had been sealed away from the elements for years. Inside the compartment, protected from the sand and sun that had weathered the rest of the aircraft, were objects that would change everything. Hank thought he understood about grief, loss, and the connections that bind strangers across oceans and decades. But as he reached toward the first item, a black rectangular device that he recognized as some kind of recording equipment, Hank had no way of knowing that opening this compartment would set in motion a chain of events that would take him further from home than he'd ever imagined, and closer to healing than he'd dared to hope. The flight recorder sat in his hands like a promise and a threat, its surface still bearing Japanese characters that he couldn't read but somehow understood were important. Whatever story this device contained, whatever final moments it had preserved from that terrible day in 2011, Hank knew he was holding more than just a piece of aviation equipment. He was holding someone's truth, someone's final words, someone's last connection to the people they'd loved. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Hank felt something other than grief and emptiness. He felt purpose. The flight recorder was heavier than Hank had expected, its metal casing solid and purposeful in his hands. Back at his workshop that evening, he cleared a space on his workbench and set the device under his brightest lamp. The black box, though it was actually orange, bore Japanese characters etched into its surface, along with what appeared to be a serial number and manufacturing date. He'd spent the rest of the afternoon at the crash site, carefully extracting everything he could find from the sealed compartment. Besides the flight recorder, there had been other items wrapped in waterproof material, a bundle of papers that looked like letters, and something smaller that he hadn't yet examined. All of it now sat on his workbench, like evidence from another world. Emma found him there at nearly midnight, hunched over the recorder with a magnifying glass and precision screwdrivers, trying to find a way to access its contents without damaging the device. "Dad?" Her voice was cautious the way it had been since Sarah died. "What is that thing?" Hank looked up, startled. Emma stood in the doorway wearing one of Sarah's old bathrobes, her dark hair tousled from sleep. In the harsh light of the work lamp, she looked younger than her 16 years. "It's a flight recorder," he said, setting down the magnifying glass. "From an aircraft I found today." Emma stepped closer, curiosity overcoming her usual wariness. "Like a black box? From a plane crash?" "Something like that." Hank gestured toward the other items. The plane was Japanese. It disappeared during the tsunami in 2011, but somehow it ended up buried in the desert. "That's impossible." Emma picked up the identification plate, studying the corroded metal. "How does a plane fly from Japan to California and just disappear in the desert?" It was the same question that had been gnawing at Hank all day. The logistics seemed impossible. A medium-sized aircraft didn't have the range to cross the Pacific without refueling, and there were no records of any Japanese aircraft making emergency landings in California during the disaster. "I don't know," Hank admitted, "but I think this might help us figure it out." He nodded toward the flight recorder. "These things record everything: conversations, radio transmissions, engine parameters." Emma was quiet for a moment, studying her father's face. "Is this why you didn't come home for dinner again?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Hank realized he'd been so caught up in the mystery that he'd forgotten about everything else, including the fact that Emma had probably made dinner for herself and eaten alone. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I lost track of time." "You always lose track of time now." Emma's voice wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. "It's like you're not really here anymore, even when you're here." She was right. Since Sarah's death, Hank had been going through the motions of living without actually engaging with life. The desert salvage work, the long hours in his garage, it was all part of the same pattern of withdrawal. "This is different," Hank said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "This plane, these things I found, I think they belong to someone who was trying to get home to his family, someone who didn't make it." Emma looked at the flight recorder, then back at her father. "So what are you going to do about it?" It was a simple question, but it felt like a challenge. He could turn everything over to the authorities and let proper agencies handle the investigation. But something about holding that flight recorder made the idea of bureaucratic processes feel inadequate. "I want to find out what's on this recorder," Hank said. "And I want to find out who was flying that plane." "You mean like investigative work? Like a detective?" Hank almost smiled at the excitement in Emma's voice. For the first time in months, she sounded interested in something he was doing. "I guess so, though I have no idea how to access a flight recorder or read Japanese." "But you know people who might." Emma was fully engaged now. "What about Marcus? Didn't he work on avionics in the Air Force?" Marcus Chen had been Hank's friend since high school. Marcus had joined the Air Force after graduation and spent 20 years as an electronics specialist before retiring to run a computer repair shop in Victorville. He was exactly the kind of person who might know how to access a flight recorder. Marcus might be able to help, Hank agreed. "Though I'm not sure he'd want to get involved in something like this." "Why don't you ask him?" Emma suggested. "What's the worst that could happen?" It was sound logic, but it also meant reaching out to someone outside the small, isolated world Hank had constructed since Sarah's death. It meant admitting he needed help. "Okay," Hank said. "I'll call Marcus tomorrow." Emma nodded, then surprised him by sitting down on the stool next to his workbench. "Can I see the other stuff you found?" Hank carefully unwrapped the bundle of papers, revealing what appeared to be handwritten letters. The paper was yellowed, but remarkably well preserved. The text was in Japanese, written in careful, practiced handwriting. "Letters," Emma said. "Personal ones by the look of them." "I think so." Hank handled the papers carefully, aware that he was holding someone's private thoughts. "There are several of them, all in the same handwriting." Emma leaned closer, studying the alien characters. "We need to find someone who can translate these. They could be important. They could also be private," Hank pointed out. "These might be personal letters that were never meant to be read by strangers. But if they were trying to get these letters to someone, maybe we should help finish what they started." It was a compelling argument. If the pilot had been carrying these letters, he'd probably intended for them to reach their recipients. "Let's see what Marcus can tell us about the flight recorder first," Hank said. "Then we can figure out the next step." Emma started to get up, then paused. "Dad, this thing you're doing, trying to solve this mystery, it's the most interested in anything I've seen you since Mom died." The observation hit Hank hard. Emma was right. For months, he'd been sleepwalking through his days. But something about this crashed aircraft had awakened a part of him that had been dormant since Sarah's illness. "Maybe that's because it's the first thing that's felt important since then," Hank said quietly. Emma studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Just don't disappear into it completely, okay? Don't let this mystery become another way to avoid dealing with real life." It was a fair warning, delivered with maturity, that reminded Hank how much Emma had been forced to grow up over the past year. "I won't," Hank promised. "And Emma, thank you for caring enough to call me on it." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Someone has to. Mum's not here to do it anymore." As Emma headed back to the house, Hank looked down at the flight recorder and letters spread across his workbench. Tomorrow he would call Marcus and begin unlocking whatever secrets the aircraft held. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was moving towards something instead of running away. Marcus Chen's computer repair shop occupied a narrow storefront in downtown Victorville, its windows cluttered with hand-lettered signs advertising virus removal and smartphone repairs. Hank hadn't been here in over 2 years, not since before Sarah's diagnosis. The bell chimed as Hank entered, carrying the flight recorder in a padded toolbox. Marcus looked up from behind a counter covered in disassembled laptops, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. "Hank Mori," Marcus said, standing and wiping his hands on a shop rag. "I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "Something like that," Hank replied, feeling the awkwardness of reconnecting after long absence. "I'm sorry I haven't been around. After Sarah died, I kind of—" "You don't need to explain," Marcus interrupted gently. "Emma told me what happened. When I ran into her at the grocery store, I should have reached out, but I wasn't sure if you wanted company or space." It was typical Marcus. direct but considerate. They'd been friends since high school because they complemented each other. Well, where Hank was methodical and cautious, Marcus was quick and adaptable. "Actually, I could use your help with something," Hank said, setting the toolbox on Marcus's counter. "Something unusual that I found in the desert yesterday. More unusual than the usual collection of rusted car parts. Much more unusual." Hank opened the toolbox and carefully lifted out the flight recorder. "I found a crashed aircraft buried in the sand near Baker, Japanese, from 2011. This was inside a sealed compartment." Marcus's expression shifted immediately from casual interest to focused attention. His 20 years in Air Force electronics had trained him to recognize important equipment. "Jesus, Hank, that's a flight data recorder, a real one." Marcus leaned closer without touching it. "Where exactly did you find this?" Hank explained the discovery of the buried aircraft, the identification plate with its Fukushima markings, and the date connecting the plane to the 2011 tsunami disaster. As he talked, Marcus's expression grew increasingly serious. "You're talking about a plane that disappeared during one of the worst natural disasters in recent history," Marcus said, "and somehow it ended up in the California desert with no record of how it got there. That's why I need your help. I want to know what's on this recorder. I want to know what happened to whoever was flying that plane." Marcus studied the device, then walked to his shop's front door, flipped the sign to closed and locked the deadbolt. "Let me make some coffee," he said. "This is going to take a while." An hour later, they had the flight recorder connected to Marcus's data recovery equipment. The process was delicate. The device had been exposed to desert conditions for over a decade. "The good news is that these things are built to survive almost anything," Marcus explained. "The bad news is that I've never actually tried to extract data from one before. This is military-grade equipment with encryption and proprietary formats. But you can do it?" "I think so. The Air Force trained me on similar systems." "But Hank..." Marcus paused and looked directly at his friend. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once we access this data, whatever we find becomes our responsibility." "I've thought about that," Hank said. "But this recorder sat in that desert for 13 years without anyone looking for it. Whatever story it tells, I think the people who should hear it never got the chance." Marcus nodded and returned to his work. The data extraction took nearly 3 hours. Finally, late in the afternoon, he sat back with a satisfied expression. "We're in," he said. "Audio files, flight data, even some encrypted sections. But Hank, most of the audio is in Japanese. I figured it would be. Can you play it anyway?" Marcus opened the first audio file, and suddenly the small repair shop was filled with voices speaking urgently in Japanese, punctuated by aircraft engines and electronic alarms. Even without understanding the language, the tension and fear in the pilot's voice was unmistakable. They listened in silence as the recording played, hearing what were clearly the final moments of a doomed flight. There were multiple voices, at least 2 men and what sounded like a woman, all speaking rapidly. The audio quality deteriorated near the end, with increasing static and mechanical stress. When the recording finished, both men sat in silence. "That was someone's last conversation," Marcus said quietly. "Their final words." "Which is why we need to find out what they were saying," Hank replied, "and why we need to find out who they were trying to reach." Marcus pulled up the flight data, displaying graphs and charts showing the aircraft's final moments. According to this, the plane was heavily loaded, more weight than normal. And look at this flight path data. The screen showed a map with a plotted course that began somewhere over the Pacific Ocean and ended abruptly at coordinates matching the crash site. "They came from the northwest," Marcus said, tracing the flight path, "probably from somewhere along the coast. But there's no departure point logged, which means they either took off from somewhere without proper air traffic control or they didn't want anyone to know where they came from," Hank finished. "Exactly. This was not a normal flight. This was someone running from something or trying to get somewhere they weren't supposed to go." Hank thought about the bundle of letters still sitting on his workbench at home. I found other things in that compartment. Letters written in Japanese, personal ones. Love letters? I think so. Or at least letters to family. I need to find someone who can translate them. And now I need someone who can translate this audio, too. Marcus saved all the recovered data to encrypted drives. I might know someone who can help with the translation. My ex-wife's sister teaches Japanese at Cal State San Bernardino, Dr. Yuki Tanaka. She specializes in contemporary Japanese language. Would she be willing to help? If I ask her the right way, probably. Yuki's always been curious about mysteries. Marcus paused. But once we start involving other people, this stops being just between us. Are you ready for that? It was a fair question. So far, only Hank, Emma, and Marcus knew about the discovery. Bringing in a translator meant expanding the circle. The people on that plane were trying to tell someone something, Hank said. The letters, the flight recorder. They were carrying messages that never got delivered. I think we owe it to them to try to finish what they started. Marcus nodded. Okay, I'll call Yuki tonight. That evening, Hank sat in his garage with the bundle of letters spread across his workbench, staring at the Japanese characters he couldn't read. Emma had made dinner for both of them, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, and they'd eaten together for the first time in weeks. Now, alone with the letters, Hank carefully examined each page. The handwriting was consistent throughout. The same person had written all of them. But there were subtle differences in ink and paper, suggesting they'd been written over time, possibly days or weeks. One letter was shorter than the others, written on different paper. At the bottom of this page, Hank noticed something he'd missed before, a small drawing in the margin. It looked like a child's artwork, simple but recognizable. A house with a smoking chimney, stick figures that might represent a family, and something that looked like an airplane in the sky above them. The drawing hit Hank harder than the technical data from the flight recorder had. This wasn't just about a crashed plane, or even about the final moments of a doomed flight. This was about real people, with families and children and lives that had been cut short. Hank picked up his phone and called Emma. "Dad, is everything okay?" "I need you to see something," Hank said. "Can you come out to the garage?" 5 minutes later, Emma was standing at his workbench, looking down at the letter with the child's drawing in the margin. "Oh my God," she whispered, "someone's kid drew this." "I think so. And I think whoever was flying that plane was trying to get this letter home to their family." Emma looked up at her father, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Hank saw something in her eyes that he'd almost forgotten. Respect for his judgment and faith in his ability to do the right thing. "We have to help them," she said simply. "Yes," Hank agreed. "We do." Dr. Yuki Tanaka's office at Cal State San Bernardino felt more like a living room than an academic workspace, with comfortable chairs arranged around a low table and walls lined with bookshelves. The afternoon sun streamed through large windows, casting warm light across framed photographs of temples and family gatherings. Hank sat across from Dr. Tanaka, the bundle of letters carefully arranged on the table between them, along with printouts of the flight recorder transcripts that Marcus had prepared. Emma sat beside him, having insisted on coming along despite Hank's initial reluctance to involve her further. Dr. Tanaka was younger than Hank had expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses. Marcus had made the introduction by phone the previous evening, explaining only that his friend had discovered some Japanese documents that might be historically significant. "Marcus tells me you found these in an unusual location," Dr. Tanaka said, carefully lifting the first letter and examining the handwriting. "Very unusual," Hank replied. "They were in an aircraft that crashed in the desert, but the plane itself disappeared from Japan in 2011 during the tsunami disaster." Dr. Tanaka's eyebrows rose slightly. "March 11th, the day that changed everything for so many families." She set the letter down gently. These documents could be very significant, historically speaking. Hank explained the discovery of the buried aircraft, keeping the details simple but honest. As he talked, Dr. Tanaka's expression grew increasingly serious. "Before I translate these," she said, "I need you to understand something. Personal letters from that time period, especially ones that were never delivered, are incredibly precious documents. They represent final thoughts, last words to loved ones." "That's exactly why we're here," Emma said. "We want to make sure these letters get to the people they were meant for." Dr. Tanaka smiled at Emma's earnestness, then turned back to the first letter. "Very well, but I should warn you, this may be emotionally difficult to hear." She began reading the first letter aloud, translating as she went. The Japanese text flowed naturally into English in her careful voice, and suddenly the unknown pilot became a real person with a name and family. "My dearest Michiko," Dr. Tanaka read, "I am writing this as we prepare for what may be our final mission. The situation here has become impossible, and I fear I may not see you and Akiko again. If something happens to me, please know that every decision I made was driven by love for our family and duty to those who cannot protect themselves." The letter continued with details about the disaster unfolding around Fukushima, the pilot's assignment to evacuation flights, and his growing realization that he might not survive the chaos. "The pilot's name was Kenji Nakamura," Dr. Tanaka said, pausing in her translation. "He was clearly military or government service, and he mentions a daughter named Akiko." "How old would she have been in 2011? Emma asked. Dr. Tanaka consulted the letter again. "He mentions her 8th birthday, which was supposed to be later that month, so she would be about 21 now, if she survived." Dr. Tanaka continued translating, moving through the collection chronologically. Each letter revealed more about Kenji Nakamura's final days, his growing desperation as the nuclear situation worsened, his frustration with evacuation procedures, and his increasing certainty that someone needed to take unauthorized action. The third letter contained the most revealing information. "I have made contact with American friends who can help with an evacuation route that bypasses the official channels. It is dangerous and probably illegal, but children are dying while we wait for proper authorization." "He was planning some kind of unauthorized rescue mission," Emma said. "That's how his plane ended up in California." "It appears so," Dr. Tanaka agreed. "But there's more." The fourth letter was different in tone, written in apparent haste. "The situation has changed completely. We have been ordered to cease all evacuation flights, but there are still children trapped in the exclusion zone. I cannot follow this order. Michiko, if you never see me again, know that I died trying to save innocent lives." Dr. Tanaka paused, in her translation removing her glasses to wipe her eyes. "I'm sorry, these letters are very moving." The fifth and final letter was the most heartbreaking. It was shorter than the others, written on different paper, the handwriting less steady. "My sweet Akiko," Dr. Tanaka read, her voice barely above a whisper. "Papa has to go away for a while, but I want you to know that you are the light of my life. Be good for Mama, study hard in school, and remember that even when you cannot see me, I am always watching over you. I have enclosed your drawing of our family because it makes me smile, even in the darkest times." At the bottom of this final letter, carefully taped to the page, was the child's drawing that Hank had noticed. Seen now in context, it wasn't just random artwork. It was an 8-year-old girl's picture of her family, given to her father as a good luck charm. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a simple house, a tall figure labeled Papa, a medium figure labeled Mama, and a small figure with pigtails labeled Akiko. Above them a small airplane flew across a blue crayon sky. Emma was crying now, and Hank felt his own eyes burning with tears he'd been holding back since Sarah's death. Dr. Tanaka sat quietly, giving them time to process what they'd heard. "This man died trying to save children," Emma said finally. "And His family never knew what happened to him. That's correct, Dr. Tanaka said. According to these letters, Kenji Nakamura was last seen on March 11, 2011, departing on an unauthorized mission to evacuate children from the Fukushima exclusion zone. But we know he made it to California, Hank said. The question is why, and what happened to the children he was trying to save? Dr. Tanaka gathered the letters carefully. Mr. Mori, these documents represent one of the most significant personal accounts from the Fukushima disaster that I've ever encountered. What we need to know, Emma said, is whether Kenji's family is still alive, and if they are, how we can get these letters to them. That's going to be complicated. Japanese privacy laws are very strict, and finding specific individuals without proper connections can be nearly impossible. But I do have contacts in Japan, colleagues who work with disaster survivor networks. You'd be willing to help us find them? Hank asked. Mr. Mori, 13 years ago, Kenji Nakamura died trying to save children he'd never met. The least I can do is help deliver his final words to the family he loved. But are you prepared for what might come next? If we find them, this information is going to change their lives. Hank thought about his own grief, about the way unresolved questions could eat away at a person's ability to heal. They deserve to know, he said. Whatever the cost, they deserve to know what happened to him and why. Dr. Tanaka nodded. Then I'll make some calls. But Mr. Mori, if Kenji Nakamura did manage to evacuate children from Fukushima, if he saved lives before his plane crashed in your desert, then his story needs to be told. Not just for his family, but for history. As they left Dr. Tanaka's office, Hank carried the letters with a new understanding of their weight. These weren't just pieces of paper anymore. They were Kenji Nakamura's legacy, his final gift to a family that had been waiting 13 years to say goodbye. The drive home was quiet, both Hank and Emma lost in their own thoughts about love and loss. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Hank felt like he was part of something larger than his own grief, something that might actually matter. In his pocket, Kenji Nakamura's final letter seemed to pulse with the weight of unfinished business, waiting to complete a journey that had begun in disaster and might finally end in peace. 3 days after their meeting with Dr. Tanaka, Hank was working under the hood of a 1987 Chevy pickup when Emma burst through the door, holding her laptop. "Dad, you need to see this right now," she said, setting the computer on his workbench. Dr. Tanaka found them. She found Kenji's family. Hank straightened up, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he moved to look at the screen. Emma had pulled up an email thread between Dr. Tanaka and her colleague in Japan, along with several attached documents and photographs. According to Dr. Tanaka's contact at the Disaster Recovery Network, Michiko and Akiko Nakamura are both alive, Emma said, scrolling through the email. They still live in Fukushima Prefecture, about 40 miles from the original exclusion zone. And Dad, look at this. She clicked on one of the attached photographs, and Hank found himself staring at a picture that took his breath away. It showed a young woman in her early 20s standing next to an older woman. But what made Hank's chest tighten was what the younger woman was holding. A framed photograph of a man in a pilot's uniform. "That's Akiko," Emma said softly. "She's 21 now. Exactly like we calculated. And that's her mother, Michiko. They've been keeping Kenji's memory alive all these years." Hank studied the photograph more closely. Akiko had grown into a beautiful young woman, but he could still see traces of the 8-year-old who had drawn that family picture. Her eyes held a sadness that seemed too old for her face, the kind of unresolved grief that Hank recognized. "What else did Dr. Tanaka find out?" he asked. Emma scrolled down to another section. "This is the incredible part. According to the Disaster Network records, Akiko has been actively researching her father's disappearance for the past 5 years. She's been trying to find out what happened to him, reaching out to government agencies, disaster response organizations, even hiring a private investigator. She's been looking for him. She never stopped looking for him, Dad. And look at this. Emma clicked on another attachment, revealing what appeared to be a carefully organized timeline. Akiko created this detailed record of everything she could find about March 11, 2011. Flight records, evacuation reports, witness statements. Hank felt a familiar ache in his chest as he looked at the timeline. The meticulous research, the refusal to give up hope, the determination to find answers. It reminded him of his own desperate need to understand and fix things. "There's more," Emma continued. "Dr. Tanaka's colleague says that Akiko actually contacted them 6 months ago, asking if they'd heard anything about missing evacuation flights from the disaster. She's been working with survivor networks across Japan. What about Michiko? How is she handling all this?" Emma's expression grew more somber. "According to the network contact, Michiko has been supportive of Akiko's search, but she's also been trying to protect her from false hope. She's worried that Akiko's obsession with finding her father is preventing her from moving forward." It was a dynamic that Hank understood intimately, the balance between honoring someone's memory and allowing yourself to heal, between seeking closure and accepting that some questions might never be answered. "Dr. Tanaka wants to know how we want to handle the contact," Emma said. "She can reach out to them through her colleague, or we can wait until we have more information about what happened to Kenji after he reached California." Hank considered the options. They had Kenji's letters and the flight recorder data, which proved that he had indeed attempted the rescue mission described in his final messages. But they still didn't know what had happened to the children he was trying to save. "Did Dr. Tanaka say anything about trying to translate the flight recorder audio?" Hank asked. "She's working on that now. Apparently the audio is pretty damaged, and some of it is in technical aviation language that's hard to translate without context. But she thinks she can have a preliminary translation ready by tomorrow." "We should wait for that," Hank decided. "If we're going to contact Kenji's family, we should have as complete a story as possible. They've been waiting 13 years for answers. They deserve to know everything we can tell them." Emma nodded, then hesitated. "Dad, there's something else. Dr. Tanaka mentioned that if we do make contact with the Nakamura family, they might want to come to California to see where Kenji's journey ended. Are you prepared for that?" The question caught Hank off guard. He'd been so focused on the mystery that he hadn't really considered the possibility of actually meeting Kenji's family face to face. The thought of standing with them at the crash site felt both deeply meaningful and terrifying. "I think so," he said. "But what about you? This is going to be emotionally intense. Are you sure you want to be involved in something this heavy?" Emma's expression was serious as she closed the laptop. "Dad, for the past 6 months, I've watched you disappear into your grief. This is the first time since Mom died that I've seen you really engaged with something, really caring about something outside of your own pain." Her words hit harder than any accusation could have. Hank had known that his withdrawal had affected Emma, but hearing her describe it so clearly forced him to confront just how much damage his inability to cope had caused. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I haven't been the father you needed me to be since your mother died." "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty," Emma said. "I'm trying to tell you that helping Kenji's family feels like the right thing to do. For them, but also for us. It's the first time in months that we've worked together on something that mattered." She was right. The investigation into Kenji's fate had brought them closer than they'd been since Sarah's illness. Working together to solve this mystery had given them a shared purpose that transcended their individual grief. "Okay," Hank said. "We'll wait for Dr. Tanaka to finish the audio translation, and then we'll reach out to the Nakamura family." "But Emma, once we do this, there's no going back." "I understand," Emma said, "but Dad, they're already processing painful information. They just don't know what it is yet. At least this way, they'll finally have the truth." That evening, Hank returned to the crash site alone. He'd driven out to the desert after dinner, needing time to think about what they were about to set in motion. The partial excavation of the aircraft looked different in the fading light of sunset. what had seemed like just another piece of desert. Salvage now felt like a sacred site, a place where someone's desperate mission had come to an end. According to the flight data that Marcus had recovered, the plane had been overloaded when it crashed. If Kenji had indeed been carrying evacuated children, there should be some evidence of that in the wreckage. Working carefully in the diminishing light, Hank began a more systematic examination of the crash site. He used his collapsible shovel to clear sand from areas he hadn't fully explored. Near what appeared to be the main passenger compartment, partially buried beneath twisted metal, Hank found something that made him stop and catch his breath. It was a small backpack, child-sized, its fabric weathered, but still intact after years. In the desert, inside the backpack were items that told a story of evacuation, a few pieces of children's clothing, a small toy car, some crackers that had turned to dust, and most significantly, a manila envelope containing what appeared to be identification documents. The papers were badly damaged, but Hank could make out enough to see that they were evacuation records for several children. Among the documents, carefully wrapped in plastic, was a set of dog tags, military identification tags bearing the name Nakamura Kenji, along with his service number and other official information. Hank sat back on his heels, holding the dog tags in his palm. These weren't just proof of Kenji's identity. They were proof that he had indeed been carrying evacuated children when his plane crashed. All of it painted a picture of a man who had died trying to save innocent lives. As the desert night settled around him, Hank felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Kenji Nakamura's dog tags seemed to pulse with the same energy as the letters in his pocket, artifacts of an unfinished mission, evidence of sacrifice that deserved to be honored. Tomorrow, when Dr. Tanaka finished translating the flight recorder audio, they would have the complete story of Kenji's final mission, and then they would reach out to his family and begin the process of bringing them the closure they had been seeking for 13 years. Hank carefully wrapped Kenji's dog tags in his handkerchief and placed them in his shirt pocket next to the letters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but tonight he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own pain. 2 weeks later, Hank stood in the arrivals hall at Los Angeles International Airport, holding a sign with Nakamura family, written in both English and the Japanese characters that Dr. Tanaka had helped him prepare. Emma stood beside him, clutching a bouquet of white lilies, flowers that Dr. Tanaka had explained were appropriate for honoring the memory of the deceased in Japanese culture. The initial contact with Michiko and Akiko Nakamura had been overwhelming. For everyone involved, Dr. Tanaka had served as an intermediary, carefully explaining the discovery of Kenji's aircraft and the personal effects found inside. The family's response had been immediate and intense. 13 years of wondering and hoping had culminated in confirmation that Kenji had indeed died on his final rescue mission, but also the promise of finally understanding what had happened. To him, Akiko had insisted on traveling to California immediately, despite her mother's concerns about the expense and emotional impact. According to Dr. Tanaka, the young woman had been obsessed with her father's disappearance for so long that the possibility of visiting his crash site and meeting the people who had found him was something she couldn't resist. "There," Emma said, pointing toward the international terminal exit. "The woman with the dark hair carrying the red handbag. She looks just like the photograph." Hank followed Emma's gaze and felt his breath catch. Michiko Nakamura was smaller than he'd expected, probably in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical style and clothes that suggested both dignity and modest means. But it was the young woman beside her who stopped Hank's heart. Akiko was the living image of the 8-year-old who had drawn that family picture, now grown into a determined young woman with her father's eyes and her mother's delicate features. As the two women approached, Hank found himself suddenly uncertain about what to say. How do you greet people who are about to confront the most painful chapter of their lives? How do you welcome strangers who are trusting you to help them find closure for a tragedy that has defined their existence for over a decade? Mr. Mori. Michiko's English was careful but clear, and her bow was formal yet warm. I am Michiko Nakamura. This is my daughter, Akiko. We are very grateful for what you have done. Please call me Hank, he replied, returning the bow as best he could. Manage. This is my daughter Emma. We're honored to meet you, and I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. Akiko stepped forward, and Hank was struck by the intensity in her eyes, the same focused determination he'd recognized in her timeline and research. Materials. Mr. Mori, you have given us something we never expected to receive. For 13 years, we have lived with questions. Now, finally, we may have answers. The drive from LAX to Barstow took nearly 3 hours, but the time passed quickly. As the Nakamura women shared stories about Kenji and their life since his disappearance, Michiko spoke about the difficulty of raising a daughter alone while dealing with her own grief, and the bureaucratic challenges of being declared a widow without a body or official confirmation of death. Akiko described her years of research, the dead ends and false hopes, the way her search for her father had become the defining purpose of her adult life. I studied English specifically so I could communicate with American authorities, Akiko explained from the back seat. I thought perhaps someone in your government or military might have records of Papa's mission that were not shared with Japanese officials. What made you think he had come to America? Emma asked. The timing, Akiko replied. Papa's plane disappeared on March 11th, but the last radio contact was not until March 12th, your time. That suggested he had crossed the international dateline. Also, Papa had mentioned American friends who might help with evacuations, though he never explained who they were or how he knew them. It was a detail that hadn't been in the letters, and Hank filed it away for later consideration. Genji Nakamura had clearly been involved in something more complex than a simple, unauthorized rescue mission. They spent that first evening at Hank's house, sharing a simple dinner and looking through the translated letters and flight recorder. Transcripts. Watching Michiko hold her husband's final words in her hands was almost too painful to witness. She read each letter carefully, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the love and desperation in Kenji's final messages. He was trying to protect us by not explaining everything, Michiko said quietly. Even in his last letters, he was being careful not to reveal details that might put us in danger. Danger from whom? Hank asked. Akiko and her mother exchanged a look that suggested they knew more than they had shared. Mr. Mori, Akiko said carefully, there are things about Papa's work that we learned only after his disappearance, things that may explain why his mission was so secret. What kind of things? Michiko reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila folder that she'd carried with her from Japan. After Kenji disappeared, I received a visit from government officials. They told me that my husband had been involved in classified disaster response operations, and that any information about his final mission was subject to national security restrictions. She opened the folder and pulled out several documents, official-looking, papers with government seals and stamps. They asked me to sign agreements stating that I would not discuss Kenji's work with media or foreign governments. In exchange, they promised to provide financial support for Akiko's education and our living expenses. Hank felt a chill run down his spine. You're saying the Japanese government knew about Kenji's mission? Not just knew about it, Akiko said, her voice tight with anger. They ordered him to stop. The letters you found don't tell the complete story, Mr. Mori. We have other documents, ones that Papa hid in our house before his final mission. She reached into her own bag and pulled out a waterproof pouch similar to the one that had protected Kenji's letters in the aircraft. Inside were several pages of handwritten notes in Japanese, along with what appeared to be official correspondence and flight manifests. These papers explain what Papa was really doing, Akiko continued. He wasn't just evacuating random children from the exclusion zone. He was evacuating the children of American scientists and military personnel who had been working at secret facilities near Fukushima. The disaster had compromised classified research, and both the Japanese and American governments wanted to control how that information was handled. Emma leaned forward, her eyes wide. So, the rescue mission was international? More than that, Michiko said. According to these documents, Kenji was ordered to cease his evacuation flights because the American government had decided that official channels were sufficient. But Papa knew that the children he was trying to save would be abandoned in the bureaucratic process, so he defied orders and attempted one final rescue flight. Hank felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. That's why there were no records of his plane crossing the Pacific. The mission was completely off the books. Yes, Akiko said, and that's why we could never get official answers about what happened to him. Both governments classified his final mission and pretended it never occurred. The implications were staggering. Kenji Nakamura hadn't just been a heroic pilot trying to save children. He had been caught in the middle of an international incident involving classified research and government cover-ups. His death in the California desert wasn't just a tragedy. It was evidence of a conspiracy that both Japanese and American authorities had worked to conceal. There's more, Michiko said quietly. 6 months ago, Akiko received a threatening phone call. Someone who claimed to work for the Japanese government told her to stop her research into her father's disappearance. They said that continuing to investigate could be dangerous for our family. That's when I contacted Dr. Tanaka's colleague, Akiko added. I was running out of official channels, and I thought perhaps academic networks might have access to information that government agencies were hiding. Hank looked at the documents spread across his dining room table. Kenji's letters, the flight recorder transcripts, the classified papers that Akiko had brought from Japan. Together, they painted a picture of a man who had died trying to do the right thing, only to have his sacrifice buried by the same governments he had served. What do you want to do with this information? Hank asked. Now that we know the truth about what happened, what's your next step? Akiko's expression hardened with determination that reminded Hank powerfully of Emma's stubborn streak. I want to expose the cover-up. I want the world to know that my father died, trying to save children that both governments were willing to abandon. And I want to make sure that the families of those children know what happened to them. That's going to be dangerous, Emma pointed out. If both governments have been covering this up for 13 years, they're not going to be happy about you going public with the truth. I know, Akiko replied, but Mr. Mori, you found my father's plane buried in the desert where it was supposed to stay hidden forever. You recovered his letters and his flight recorder and his personal effects. You gave us back his voice and his final words. Now we have an obligation to honor his sacrifice by telling his story. Michiko nodded slowly. For 13 years, I have kept silent because I was afraid and because I thought it was what Kenji would have wanted. But reading his letters, understanding what he died for, I realized that staying silent dishonors his memory. Hank felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. They had stumbled onto something much larger than a simple aviation mystery. The buried aircraft in the Mojave Desert wasn't just the site of a tragic crash. It was evidence of an international conspiracy, a cover-up that had denied closure to multiple families for over a decade. If we're going to do this, Hank said carefully, we need to be smart about it. We need documentation, witnesses, and protection. We can't just call a press conference and hope for the best. What do you suggest? Akiko asked. First, we visit the crash site. We document everything we can find and make sure we have complete records of all the evidence. Then we contact investigative journalists who specialize in government cover-ups. People who know how to protect sources and break stories safely, Emma nodded. And we make sure that multiple copies of all the documents are stored in different places with different people. That way, if someone tries to silence us, the story still gets told. As they made plans for the following day's trip to the crash site, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Finding Kenji Nakamura's letters had seemed like a simple matter of returning lost property to a grieving family. Now it was becoming something much more complex and potentially dangerous. But looking at Akiko's determined face, seeing the hope in Michiko's eyes as she held her husband's final words, Hank knew they had no choice. Kenji Nakamura had died trying to save innocent children, and his family had spent 13 years seeking the truth about his sacrifice. The least they could do was help finish what he had started. The next morning, 3 black SUVs were parked across the street from Hank's house. Emma noticed them first, peering through the kitchen window as she made coffee for their planned trip to the crash site. "Dad," she called quietly, "I think we have a problem." Hank joined her at the window, and his stomach dropped. The vehicles were obviously government, too clean, too uniform, too deliberately positioned to be anything else. Through the tinted windows, he could make out the shapes of multiple occupants, all apparently watching his house. "How long have they been there?" he asked. "I don't know. They were there when I got up 20 minutes ago." Michiko and Akiko emerged from the guest room, already dressed for their desert expedition. Akiko took one look at Hank and Emma's faces and immediately understood something was wrong. "What has happened?" she asked. "We have visitors," Hank said, nodding toward the window. "Official-looking ones." Akiko peered through the curtains and went pale. "They found us faster than I expected." "You expected this?" Emma asked. "I hoped we would have more time," Akiko replied. "But yes, I knew that coming to America with these documents would eventually draw attention." Michiko moved to the window and studied the vehicles with the calm assessment of someone who had dealt with government surveillance before. 3 cars means at least 12 agents, she said quietly. "They are not here to ask polite questions." Hank felt his mouth go dry. In all his years as a mechanic, dealing with nothing more complicated than engine troubles and customer complaints, he'd never imagined finding himself in the middle of an international incident. "What do they want?" "The documents," Akiko said. "The flight recorder, everything we found. They want to make sure this story never becomes public. And if we refuse to cooperate..." Akiko and her mother exchanged another of their loaded glances. "Mr. Mori," Michiko said carefully, "in Japan, people who cause inconvenience for the government sometimes have accidents, car crashes, heart attacks, falls from buildings. I suspect that in America, the methods are similar." Emma grabbed Hank's arm. "Dad, we need to get out of here. Now." But before they could move toward the back door, a knock echoed through the house. 3 sharp, authoritative raps that seemed to demand immediate compliance. "Mr. Mori?" The voice was crisp, professional, American. "This is Agent Williams with the Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you about some items you may have discovered in the desert." Hank looked at the faces around him. Emma frightened but determined, Michiko resigned but calm, Akiko burning with the same fierce anger he'd seen when she'd talked about her father's cover-up. They were waiting for him to make a decision that would affect all their lives. "Do we have everything?" he whispered. Akiko patted her bag. "All the documents plus copies. The flight recorder data is on multiple drives." "The physical artifacts?" "In my workshop," Hank said. "Kenji's dog tags. Some of the letters, the child's backpack." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Mori, we know you're home. We just want to talk." "Through the back," Emma whispered. "To the garage. We can take the truck through the alley." They moved quickly but quietly through the house, gathering the remaining artifacts from Hank's workshop and loading them into his pickup truck. The government vehicles were positioned to watch the front and side streets, but the alley behind his property offered a possible escape route. As Hank started the truck, keeping the engine as quiet as possible, Akiko opened the carefully preserved bag she'd been carrying since arriving from Japan. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, was something she hadn't shown them the night before, a metal container about the size of a coffee can with Japanese characters etched into its surface. "My father's ashes," she said simply. "What we could recover after the tsunami destroyed our original home. I brought them because I hoped we might be able to honor him properly at the place where he died." The weight of that revelation settled over the truck as Hank carefully backed out of his garage and into the alley. They weren't just running from government agents with evidence of a cover-up. They were carrying the remains of a man who had died trying to save children, and his family's hope for finally laying him to rest. "Where are we going?" Emma asked as they navigated the back streets of Barstow, staying off the main roads that might be monitored. "The crash site," Akiko said firmly. "They may be able to stop us from going public with Papa's story, but they cannot stop us from honoring his memory at the place where his journey ended." "It's not safe," Hank protested. "They'll follow us there." "Then we make sure we get there first," Michiko said with quiet determination. "And we make sure that if they want to silence us, they have to do it at the place where an innocent man already died for trying to do the right thing." The drive to the crash site took longer than usual, as Hank took a circuitous route through back roads and mining tracks, constantly checking his mirrors for signs of pursuit. But the desert was vast, and there were countless ways to reach their destination if you knew the terrain well enough. As they approached the site where Kenji's aircraft lay buried, Hank was struck by how different it looked with passengers who understood its significance. This wasn't just another piece of desert salvage anymore. It was a memorial, a crime scene, and a testament to one man's courage in the face of impossible choices. They parked near the excavated sections of the fuselage, and Akiko immediately moved toward the aircraft with the reverent manner of someone approaching a shrine. She knelt beside the exposed cockpit area, placing her hands on the weathered metal that had carried her father on his final mission. "Papa," she whispered in Japanese, then switched to English for the benefit of Hank and Emma. "We found you. We know what you did. We know why you never came home." Michiko joined her daughter beside the aircraft, and together they performed what appeared to be a brief ceremony, speaking quietly in Japanese, bowing deeply, and placing small offerings of flowers and incense beside the wreckage. "They're saying goodbye," Emma said softly. "No," Hank corrected, watching the intensity on Akiko's face as she photographed every detail of the crash site. "They're saying hello. This is the first time they've been able to visit the place where he died. This is the first time they've had somewhere to direct their grief." While the Nakamura women conducted their ceremony, Hank and Emma worked to document everything they could about the crash site. They photographed the aircraft from every angle, collected additional artifacts that had been missed in earlier excavations, and created a detailed record of the evidence that proved Kenji's final mission had been real. It was Emma who spotted the dust cloud on the horizon, a line of vehicles approaching fast across the desert floor. "They found us," she said. Akiko looked up from her ceremony, her face set with determination. "Then we finish this properly." She opened the metal container holding her father's ashes and began to scatter them around the aircraft wreckage, speaking in rapid Japanese that sounded like both prayer and promise. Michiko joined her, and together they completed a ritual that had been 13 years in the making. As the government vehicles drew closer, Hank realized that everything was about to change. In a few minutes they would be confronted by agents who wanted to bury Kenji's story forever, to silence the family that had spent 13 years seeking truth. But standing here beside the aircraft where a hero had died, surrounded by people who refused to let his sacrifice be forgotten, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a willingness to fight for something larger than himself. "Whatever happens next," he said to the group gathered around Kenji's final resting place, "we make sure his story gets told. We make sure the children he died trying to save are remembered. We make sure that courage like his isn't buried in government files and forgotten. Akiko nodded, clutching the metal container that had held her father's ashes. Papa's mission ends here, but ours is just beginning. The vehicles were close enough now that they could hear the engines, see the sun reflecting off windshields. In a few moments, they would have to face the consequences of their decision to seek truth instead of accepting comfortable lies. But for now, in this quiet moment beside a buried aircraft in the vast Mojave Desert, a father's sacrifice had finally been properly honored, and his family had finally been able to say goodbye. The three black SUVs formed a semicircle around the crash site, their engines running as agents in dark suits emerged into the desert heat. Agent Williams, a tall man with steel-gray hair, approached the group gathered around Kenji's aircraft. "Mr. Mori," he said, his voice carrying across the desert silence. "Mrs. Nakamura, Miss Nakamura, I need you to step away from the aircraft and surrender any materials you've removed from this site." Hank moved protectively in front of the Nakamura women, Emma beside him. "This is public land," he said. "We have every right to be here." "Actually, you don't." Agent Williams produced a document from his jacket. "As of 6 hours ago, this area has been designated a national security site under the Patriot Act. Any unauthorized personnel found here are subject to immediate detention." Akiko stepped forward, her jaw set with determination. "You cannot simply declare my father's grave a restricted area to cover up your crimes." "Miss Nakamura," Agent Williams said, his tone becoming colder. "Your father was involved in unauthorized activities that compromised sensitive operations. The aircraft wreckage contains classified materials that pose a threat to national security. The only threat is to the reputation of the people who ordered him to abandon those children." Akiko shot back. "My father died trying to save innocent lives while your governments played politics." Emma pulled out her phone and began recording, but one of the agents immediately moved to confiscate it. "No recordings," Agent Williams said. "This is a classified operation." "Then why are you conducting it in broad daylight in front of witnesses?" Hank asked. Agent Williams' expression suggested he was losing patience. "Because you've been sharing classified information. Because you're planning to go public with materials that could damage important diplomatic relationships." "You mean materials that could expose the truth about what happened here?" Michiko said quietly. "Materials that could force both our governments to acknowledge that they abandoned children to protect their secrets." "Mrs. Nakamura," Agent Williams said, "your husband chose to violate direct orders and engage in unauthorized activities. His death was tragic, but it was also the predictable consequence of his reckless actions." The words hit the desert air like a physical blow. Then Akiko spoke, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "Reckless? My father spent his life serving his country and protecting innocent people. When faced with a choice between following orders and saving children's lives, he chose to save the children. How is that reckless?" "Because those children were not his responsibility," Agent Williams replied. "Because proper channels existed for their evacuation." "What proper channels?" Emma demanded. "What was more important than getting kids to safety, Agent?" Williams hesitated, and in that hesitation, Hank saw the truth. "There were no other evacuation plans, were there?" he said. "You were going to leave those children behind, rather than admit that American personnel had been working at classified facilities near Fukushima. The situation was complex." "The situation was simple," Akiko interrupted. "Children were in danger and my father had the means to save them. Everything else was politics." Agent Williams gestured to his team, and several agents began moving closer. "I'm going to ask you one more time to surrender the materials you've taken from this site and submit to debriefing. And if we refuse," Hank asked, "then you'll be detained under provisions of the Patriot Act." Hank felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. They could surrender the evidence and probably return to their normal lives with the understanding that they would never speak about what they'd discovered. It would be the safe choice. But looking at Akiko's face, Seeing the fierce determination that reminded him of Emma's stubborn streak, he realized that some things were more important than safety. "No," he said simply. "No, no, we won't surrender the materials. No, we won't submit to debriefing. And no, we won't help you cover up the truth about what happened here. Mr. Mori, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation." "I understand it perfectly," Hank replied. "You're asking us to help you bury the story of a man who died trying to save children. You're asking us to silence a family that has spent 13 years seeking answers." Emma moved closer to her father, pulling out a bronze plaque she'd been carrying in her backpack. "We're not leaving," she said, "and we're not surrendering anything. We came here to honor a hero, and that's what we're going to do." The plaque was simple but elegant, engraved with Japanese and English text, "In memory of Kenji Nakamura, who died March 12, 2011, while attempting to evacuate children from the Fukushima disaster zone. His courage will not be forgotten." Akiko gasped when she saw the plaque, tears streaming down her face. "You made this for Papa." "Emma's idea," Hank said. "She thought he deserved to be properly remembered." Agent Williams's patience finally snapped. "This is enough. Take them into custody." But as the agents moved forward, Akiko did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. She pulled out her phone and began speaking rapidly in Japanese, her voice carrying clearly across the desert as she live-streamed to what appeared to be a significant audience. "She's broadcasting," one of the agents said urgently, "live-streamed to multiple platforms." Agent Williams looked genuinely rattled for the first time. "Cut the transmission." "Can't do it without jamming equipment," the first agent replied. Akiko continued speaking in Japanese, but Hank caught enough words to understand that she was telling her father's story to a live audience. The view count on her phone was climbing rapidly. Hundreds, then thousands of people watching in real time. "Miss Nakamura," Agent Williams said, his voice tight with anger, "end that transmission immediately." Akiko looked directly into her phones. Camera and spoke in clear English. "My name is Akiko Nakamura. 13 years ago, my father died trying to save children from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The American and Japanese governments have covered up his story, but today, at the place where he died, I am telling you the truth." She turned the phone toward the aircraft wreckage, toward the bronze plaque that Emma held, toward the agents who were now frozen in uncertainty. "This is where heroes die," Akiko continued, "and this is where lies come to be exposed." Agent Williams spoke urgently into his radio, calling for instructions. But Hank realized that it was too late for damage control. The truth about Kenji Nakamura's sacrifice was now being broadcast live to thousands of people, and no amount of government authority could put that information back into classified files. The memorial plaque gleamed in Emma's hands, reflecting the desert sun like a beacon. Agent Williams received new orders through his earpiece, his face growing pale as he listened. The live stream had gone viral. Tens of thousands of viewers were now watching Akiko tell her father's story in real time, and major news outlets in both Japan and America were beginning to pick up the broadcast. "Stand down," he said quietly to his team. "New orders from Washington." The agents stepped back, but their hands remained near their weapons. The situation had become too public to handle through force, but Hank could see the calculation in Agent Williams's eyes. They were looking for another way to contain the damage. Akiko continued her broadcast, now switching between Japanese and English to reach the widest possible audience. She held up her father's dog tags, showing them to the camera as she explained how Kenji had died, carrying evacuated children to safety. "For 13 years, my mother and I believed that Papa was lost at sea," she said. "We were told that his final mission was classified, that we could never know what happened to him. But the truth is that he died here in this desert because he chose to save innocent lives instead of following orders to abandon them." Emma stepped into the camera's view, holding the bronze memorial plaque. "This is Kenji Nakamura's memorial," she said clearly. It's going to stay here, at the place where he died, so that everyone will know what he sacrificed for those children. The viewer count on Akiko's phone had climbed to over 50,000. Comments were pouring in, messages of support in multiple languages, expressions of outrage about the government cover-up, and most importantly, contact information from families who claimed their children had been evacuated from Fukushima by a Japanese pilot on March 12, 2011. My God, Michiko whispered, reading some of the comments. These people remember Kenji. These families remember him saving their children. One comment stood out among the others, a message in English from someone identifying themselves as Dr. Robert Chen, formerly of the Pacific Nuclear Research Facility. Kenji Nakamura saved my daughter Sarah and 11 other children. We've been looking for him for 13 years to thank him. He's a hero. Akiko read the comment aloud to her audience, then looked directly into the camera. Papa, you see? The children you saved grew up. Their families never forgot you. Your sacrifice mattered. Agent Williams was speaking urgently into his radio again, but Hank could tell that the situation had moved beyond the government's ability to control. The story was spreading too fast, reaching too many people, generating too much public attention to simply make disappear. Mr. Mori, Agent Williams said, approaching the group with obvious reluctance. I've been instructed to inform you that the Patriot Act designation for this site is being rescinded. You're free to remain here and conduct your memorial service. Just like that? Emma asked suspiciously. The situation has become politically complex, Agent Williams admitted. There are families coming forward now, people who can corroborate Miss Nakamura's account. The cover-up is no longer sustainable. Akiko looked up from her phone, where messages of support continued to pour in. What about the children Papa was carrying when he crashed? What happened to them? Agent Williams hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Your father managed to land the aircraft before it was completely disabled. The children survived the crash. They were evacuated to medical facilities in Los Angeles and eventually reunited with their families. The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. For a moment, everyone was silent as the implications sank in. Papa succeeded, Akiko whispered. He saved them. Yes, Agent Williams said quietly. He saved them. But admitting that would have meant acknowledging the classified operations near Fukushima, the unauthorized evacuation route, the diplomatic agreements that were violated. Both governments decided it was easier to classify the entire incident and pretend it never happened. Hank felt a surge of emotion, relief, anger, and profound sadness, all mixed together. Kenji Nakamura had died, but his mission had succeeded. The children he'd tried to save had lived, grown up, started families of their own. His sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Emma carefully placed the memorial plaque against the aircraft wreckage, positioning it so the inscription would be clearly visible to anyone who visited the site. There, she said, now everyone will know. Akiko ended her live stream after speaking directly to the families who had reached out, promising to contact them and share what she'd learned about her father's final mission. The final viewer count was over 100,000 people, and the story was already being picked up by major news networks around the world. As the government agents prepared to leave, Agent Williams approached Hank one final time. For what? It's worth, he said quietly. Your daughter is right. Kenji Nakamura was a hero. It took courage to tell his story. It took courage for him to live it, Hank replied. After the agents had gone, the four of them stood together beside the memorial, black in the growing desert twilight. The bronze inscription gleamed in the last rays of sunlight, a permanent reminder of one man's choice to value human life above political convenience. Michiko placed a small bouquet of flowers beside the plaque, then spoke quietly in Japanese, words that sounded like both prayer and promise. Akiko took photographs of the memorial from every angle, documenting the place where her 13-year search for answers had finally come to an end. What happens now? Emma asked. Now we go home, Akiko said. But first, we visit the families of the children Papa saved. We let them know that we've finally found the man who gave their children a second chance at life. As they walked back toward Hank's truck, Akiko carefully carried the restored family photograph that Hank had painstakingly repaired, the damaged picture of Kenji with his wife and young daughter that had been found among his personal effects. The image was whole again, just as their understanding of his final mission was now complete. The desert stars were beginning to appear as they drove away from the crash site, leaving behind the memorial that would ensure Kenji Nakamura's sacrifice would never again be forgotten. In the distance, the bronze plaque caught the last light of day, marking the place where a hero's journey had ended and where, finally, the truth had been allowed to shine. 6 months later, Hank stood in the conference room of a modest office building in downtown Los Angeles, watching Emma explain the mission of the Kenji Nakamura Foundation to a group of disaster relief coordinators. At 22, she had grown into the kind of confident young woman that Sarah would have been proud of, someone who understood that healing came not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into purpose. The foundation focuses on helping families locate missing loved ones after natural disasters, Emma said, clicking through a presentation that featured photographs from their work in Turkey, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. We provide translation services, coordinate with international agencies, and most importantly, we never give up on bringing families closure. The foundation had grown beyond anything Hank had imagined when they'd first discussed the idea in Dr. Tanaka's office. What had started as a way to honor Kenji's memory had become a living testament to the power of persistence and hope. They'd helped reunite dozens of families, provided closure for countless others, and created a network of volunteers who understood that sometimes the most important work happened in the spaces between official channels. Akiko sat in the front, Rao, taking notes and preparing for her own presentation. She'd moved to California 6 months earlier, using her inheritance money and a small grant from a Japanese peace organization to establish the foundation's first permanent office. Her English had improved dramatically, but more importantly, her purpose had crystallized into something focused and powerful. The charter document for the foundation sat framed on the wall behind Emma, an official recognition of their work signed by both the governor of California and the Japanese consul general. It represented something that neither government had been able to suppress: the simple truth that individual courage could create lasting change. After the presentation, Hank drove with Akiko to the small apartment she'd rented in a neighborhood that reminded her of home. Over the past 6 months, they'd developed an easy friendship built on shared loss and shared purpose. Akiko had become the little sister Emma had never had, and Hank had discovered that helping someone else heal had somehow helped him heal as, well, the Survivor Network in Japan wants us to open a branch office in Tokyo, Akiko said as they sat in her kitchen, drinking the green tea she'd taught him to prepare properly. They think our approach, combining technology with personal outreach, could help hundreds of families. Are you ready for that? Hank asked. Going back to Japan, dealing with all the memories, Akiko smiled, and Hank was struck by how much stronger she seemed than the desperate young woman who had arrived at LAX 6 months earlier. Papa's story taught me that running toward difficult things is sometimes the only way to honor the people we've lost. That afternoon, they made their monthly pilgrimage to the crash site in the Mojave Desert. The memorial had grown since their confrontation with the government agents. Visitors had left flowers, photographs, and small personal tributes around the bronze plaque. Someone had built a small stone cairn nearby, and others had added their own memorial plaques honoring family members lost in disasters around the world. The site had become an unofficial shrine to anyone who had died trying to help others, a place where the concept of heroism was measured not by public recognition, but by personal sacrifice. Tour groups occasionally visited, guided by a small non-profit that had sprung up to maintain the memorial and tell Kenji's story to anyone who wanted to listen. Akiko placed fresh flowers beside her father's plaque, then sat quietly in the desert, sand for a few minutes. Hank had learned to give her this time, moments when she could speak to her father privately, updating him on the Foundation's work and the lives that continued to be touched by his final mission. "Ready?" she asked, standing and brushing sand from her clothes. As they drove back toward Los Angeles, Hank's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad, check the news. Dr. Chen's documentary about the Foundation just won an award at the film festival. They want to interview us for a follow-up piece." The documentary had been Dr. Robert Chen's way of saying thank you, not just for saving his daughter 13 years earlier, but for finally allowing him to properly honor the man who had given his family a second chance. It had premiered at several international film festivals, spreading awareness of the Foundation's work and inspiring similar organizations in other countries. "Your father would be proud," Hank said to Akiko as they navigated the evening traffic. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've accomplished it, with grace, with determination, and without losing sight of what really matters." "He would be proud of you too," Akiko replied. "You lost someone you loved, and instead of letting that loss destroy you, you used it to help other people find what they had lost. That takes a different kind of courage." That evening, Hank sat in his garage, the same space where he'd first examined Kenji's flight recorder and letters 6 months earlier. But instead of the desperate, lonely man who had been hiding from his grief, he now felt connected to something larger than himself. The Foundation's work had given him a way to honor both Sarah's memory and his own need to fix things that seemed unfixable. Emma was in her room, video chatting with Foundation volunteers in 3 different time zones, coordinating search efforts. For families affected by a recent earthquake in Indonesia, the house that had once felt too empty, too full of memories, now buzzed with purpose and connection. On his workbench, in a place of honor next to his most treasured tools, sat a small, framed photograph, Kenji's restored family picture showing a young pilot with his wife and 8-year-old daughter. Beside it was another photo, more recent, Akiko and Emma standing together at the memorial site, representing 2 generations united by loss but defined by hope. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the Joshua trees, carrying with it the promise that some stories, the ones that matter most, never really end. They just find new voices to tell them, new hearts to carry them forward, new ways to transform private grief into public good. The Kenji Nakamura Foundation would continue its work long after Hank and Akiko were gone, helping families find closure, and ensuring that no sacrifice made in service of others would ever again be buried in bureaucratic silence. It was a legacy built on the simple understanding that healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from finding ways to honor it that benefit the future. In the morning, there would be new cases to investigate, new families to help, new opportunities, to prove that individual courage could create lasting change. But tonight, in the quiet of his garage, surrounded by the tools and memories that defined his life, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: peace.